Welcome to our last session of the day. After this, we are going to have a panel discussion. So hopefully you've been putting together some thoughts as to what you'd like to ask some of our speakers. So that'll be at 3:35, right after and this next class by Dr. Reggie Williams. So in 2014, Dr. Williams published Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. The subtitle of that book is Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance. When I read Dr. Williams' book, I can truly say it impacted me in the most profound way. I learned that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who we know and love, was more impacted by his time in Harlem, USA, than in Germany. That blew my mind. In his time in the United States, as he was living in the non-dominant culture of his day in the 1930s and 40s in the United States, he learned about the Sermon on the Mount and how to live it out in practical, literal ways. He then took this theology back to Germany and was also able to fight for the non-dominant in his society, in this case, the Jews. If we are to be shaped by the Sermon on the Mount, we must strive to understand the scriptures through the experience of the non-dominant among us. At least that's what I believe. Prayerfully, you'll get as much out of what I learned from Dr. Williams as I did. I give you Reggie Williams.
Hello, friends. So good to be with you. Otoma, thank you so much for that really generous introduction. It is a joy to share something that you spend time working on, writing, thinking, with people who find it interesting and not boring. So I'm grateful for that experience. And I hope that we're able to have some conversation about this. I want to try and keep it so that I'm going to be sharing with you kind of the heart of what I did in that research project about Bonhoeffer's time in the United States. So I encountered this when I was a PhD student initially, just taking a class with my Dr. Father Glenn Stassen and a friend of mine who we were both studying Bonhoeffer together. We were in a conversation about Bonhoeffer and the time that he came over to the United States. And I had done some research in another class on the Harlem Renaissance, specifically on Aaron Douglas, the famous artist of the Harlem Renaissance. And I recognized that Bonhoeffer's time as a fellowship student, a Sloan Fellow, an exchange student at Union Seminary after his dissertation, after he completed a PhD and a second dissertation, he came over to the United States for a time, 1930-31. I recognized at that time corresponded with the Harlem Renaissance. And I wondered if it mattered at all to him, if he had any encounter with it. And in my study of him, came to find out that he had an extensive encounter with it. And there was nothing written on it at all, nothing substantial written on that. One book by a friend, by a scholar named Josiah Ulysses Young, who was not doing a biographical encounter with him, but looking at his research in light of what racism is, kind of putting them side by side. I wanted to hear from him himself what he experienced during that time, and see what we can't learn from that. I wrote that out into a dissertation and had to take from that dissertation to turn it into a book. The book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and Ethic of Resistance, is mainly what I'm going to be talking about here today. That's the substance of this conversation. So I've called this lecture Prophetic Christian Social Ethics, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Jesus and the Disinherited, taking a little bit off of Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited. But the prophetic social Christian ethics, it's prophetic in a sense of truth to power. I want to share with you a couple of slides, a couple of statements from Bonhoeffer first. In sum, the time that he has in the United States, where he turns 25 years old during that year, he turns 25 in February of 1931. He goes over in August of 1930 when he's 24, turns 25 during that year. He is young, impressionable, and not sure that he wants to remain a theologian. Although he's written a dissertation and what they call a habilitation, a second dissertation, which qualifies him to be a professor at the university where he had done his PhD. At age 24, he's qualifies to be a professor with 2 dissertations written. He wants to be ordained in the church, Lutheran church, but he's too young. He has to be 25. Takes some time off to go and study in the United States, see the world a little bit. But the time is post-World War I. He's had a brother killed, another brother wounded, cousins killed. Everyone in Germany, most everyone in Germany has had some encounter with death in their family as a result of World War I. Poverty is rampant. The country itself is in this state of shame, being blamed completely for World War I and indebted to the Allies who beat them, financially indebted. They'd be paying these monetary reparations until the 1960s. It's 1930 here. In 1919, they were put under that burden with the Versailles Peace Conference. He's trained to be a theologian after World War I. The only one in his family who has any interest in theology. His mother has some church background, but the family doesn't go to church, and they can't understand why the youngest boy of 4 boys and 4 girls, the second youngest child, well, 3 because he's got a twin sister, is interested in theology. But as he's doing his training, he comes to the point where he's losing his interest. Why? The church, as it's situated in Germany, is a relic of upper class culture. It is the bourgeoisie, what they call in Germany the Bildungsbürgertum, an educated upper class, not quite aristocratic, but not too far from that. It doesn't say anything to the conditions of poor people. It doesn't, and as such, it doesn't say anything to the conditions of a country that is languishing in post-war shame. It is bourgeois, Bildungsbürgertum. What does it have to say to us? It's questionable. He's looking for a gospel, a Christian message that speaks to the entirety of our experiences, especially in this wounded time. But instead, it speaks another language. Hear this, that he speaks as a visiting pastor in Barcelona, 1928-29. He gives 3 academic lectures and about 20 sermons as a visiting pastor. He says this. Now, how do I advance my slides here? IT help. I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. Okay. I just advanced them there. Did they advance for you all? Did Tyler or Otama, did the slide advance? Okay. I see that it did advance. So, okay, good. Bonhoeffer in 1929 says, God gave me my mother, my people, folk. This is a language, that's a term that's embedded with meaning in German that's difficult to translate into English. Spirit of a people, my folk, the German folk. For what I am, I think my people. What I am through my people. And so what I have should also belong to my people. That is the divine order of things, orders of creation language, a significant problem in the history of creation of Christianity. Orders of creation gave the slave owner the right to own Africans. That is the divine order of things, because they are supposed to be enslaved and these people are supposed to have and own everything. Orders of creation is what told them that the German people were above the Jewish people, that the non-Jewish German is above the Jewish person. For God created the people, the folk. If for a single moment I do not act, he's speaking in a post-war context, and he's thinking in light of war, then I am doing nothing other than surrendering my neighbors. And in such cases, I no longer have the choice between good and evil. I will take up arms with the terrible knowledge of doing something horrible, and yet knowing I can do no other. I will defend my brother, my mother, my people, and yet I know I can do so only by spilling blood. But love for my people will sanctify murder, will sanctify war. Bonhoeffer before Harlem, age 24. Bonhoeffer after Harlem, age 25. God has arranged it so that all races of humanity, all, not just my folk, come from one blood. Therefore, a defiant ethnic pride in flesh and blood is a sin against the Holy Spirit. This folkish rhetoric that he was once a fan of is now a sin against the Holy Spirit. As much as the Christian would like to remain distant from political struggle, nonetheless, even here, the commandment of love urges the Christian to stand up for his neighbor, not just his folk, but his neighbor. His faith and love must know whether the dictates of the state may lead him against his conscience. What has happened? Something has happened to that guy. I am clear that this change in him was the result of time spent in the United States. His dear friends said most, if not all, of his free time was spent in Harlem. What was this learning that happened for him in Harlem that had this kind of effect? Well, let's dive in. Spring of 1931 was the second semester of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Sloan Fellowship year at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Sloan Fellow was a fellowship that was given to European students who would come over for 1 year and earn what was then a Bachelor of Divinity. Today we call it a Master of Divinity. There was a Frenchman, there was a Swiss person, and there was a German. But the German, coming from, had already written 2 dissertations. He didn't need a Bachelor of Divinity. The Swiss and the French person came over and did exactly that under Sloan fellowships. With the arrival of the spring, the influential stay in America for the now 24-year-old genius from Berlin was nearing its final months. Miles Horton, founder of the Highlander folk school that trained Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, and so forth, was a student with Bonhoeffer at Union at this time. A fellow student and friend later recalled an uncharacteristic encounter with Bonhoeffer in the lobby of the seminary just near student housing where they both were residing. In that lobby, on a Sunday afternoon during the spring semester, Miles Horton saw Bonhoeffer as he was returning to the seminary from the prominent Black church Abyssinian Baptist, which was not more than a 45-minute walk from Union Seminary. I've done that walk myself several times, into the heart of Harlem. Bonhoeffer was a lay leader there at Abyssinian, where he and his friend, Albert Franklin Fisher, one of a small number of African-American students at Union that year, regularly taught Sunday school to a group of boys. Horton noticed that Bonhoeffer was lingering in the lobby, and to Horton's surprise, Bonhoeffer was quite emotional, which was out of character for his typically logical and unemotive temperament. He was excited to talk about that day at church. Horton remembered Bonhoeffer referring to the Black church as the only time he had experienced true religion in the United States. In that conversation, Bonhoeffer said that he was convinced that it was only among Blacks who were oppressed that there could be any real religion in this country. As Horton reflected on this encounter with Bonhoeffer years afterward, he recalled, "Perhaps that Sunday afternoon, I witnessed a beginning of his identification with the oppressed, which played a role in the decision that led to his death." The year following that conversation in the lobby at Union with Bonhoeffer, Miles Horton, together with his friend Jim Dombrowski, as I've already said, went on to found the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. That school played a significant role in the civil rights movement. Like Horton and Dombrowski, Bonhoeffer was influenced by encounters with African Americans, which helped place him on a trajectory that saw solidarity with suffering and oppressed people as core to Christian discipleship. In other words, it is not the Christ risen with all power who guides discipleship, but the Christ with and among those on the margins, or what others will say, the Christ who demonstrates God's preferential treatment for the outcast, who will recognize the woman with the 2 mites over everybody else who's giving out of their abundance at the temple. But Bonhoeffer was not always so excited about being in New York. His experience in the classroom at Union began in a very unremarkable way. Only in the spring semester did he have anything positive to say about his academic experience at Union. For example, that spring, Bonhoeffer took a course with Dr. Reinhold Niebuhr, a famed theologian, once called America's top theologian. Bonhoeffer took this class entitled Ethical Viewpoints in Modern Literature. In his end of the year summary to the Church Federation in Germany, the place where his ordination process would happen, he describes that course in the following way. In a lecture course, in a lecture course by Dr. Niebuhr, the social and Christian problem was discussed in the context of modern American literature. That was extremely informative. I learned much from my own experiences in Harlem. That class was one in a collection of classes that he took that spring. That class was one in a collection of classes he took that spring in a course schedule that looked different than it did in the fall. His different schedule corresponded with a number of changes that took place for him between the 2 semesters. The most notable transition was his opinion of the theological community at Union. Indeed, a letter written home to his church superintendent in December, shortly after the completion of his first semester, summed up his feelings about his experience in the seminary in the fall. So I want you to recognize, so this statement about the lecture course with Niebuhr comes later. What I'm about to read to you comes in his first semester. There is no theology here. Although I'm basically taking classes and lectures in dogmatics and philosophy of religion, the impression is overwhelmingly negative. They talk a blue streak without the slightest substantive foundation and with no evidence of any criteria. The students, on average, 25 to 30 years old, are completely clueless as to the pertinent questions he's saying. I'm not the only one who recognizes that when Dietrich shows up in New York, he's pretty arrogant. He's pretty confident in himself. So what happens here? Clearly, by the spring, he was in touch with something much more meaningful in New York. The different tone about learning at Union corresponds with a developing appreciation for social justice as a core component of obedience to Christ. It's a difference that I'm arguing was in part influenced by his experiences in Harlem and in the southern states. Experiences like the one he described to Miles Horton that apprehended him in an uncharacteristically passionate way. Hence, Bonhoeffer's positive description of several spring semester courses, including Niebuhr's class and his encounter with Miles Horton, indicate a turning for him that may tell us something of the personal significance of that year in New York for him and his subsequent Christian witness in Germany. Just as I began this lecture with, I ask again now, what was this learning that he was referring to in Harlem? We may begin to discern an answer to that question by paying attention to what was going on in Harlem at the time of his Sloan Fellowship year. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Sloan Fellow studying at Union Seminary during the Harlem Renaissance, at the beginning of the Great Depression, in Abyssinian Baptist Church, the largest Black church in the country at the time, or just Baptist congregation as well. That means that all of his descriptions of his involvement in African American life, 1930-31, were occurring during this critical moment in African American history, in this critical space. He turned 25 years old in February of that school year. Thus, in addition to the time and place being very influential in the course of African American history, Bonhoeffer was in Harlem experiencing that critical moment while he was still young and impressionable. In New York, the Harlem Renaissance consisted of the effort to introduce the world to a new Negro, as it was described at the time. This new Negro was really a different way to see and to think of peoples of African descent than the very dominant, gross caricatures that served as propaganda for white supremacy. This slide that I have before you now is painted, it's a painting by the African-American artist, the singularly important African-American artist of the Harlem Renaissance movement, Aaron Douglas. It's called The Song of the Two Towers. And in this painting, you'll notice two figures. By the way, Douglas painted with two-dimensional Egyptian cave paintings, funeral cage paintings, cave paintings. The walk like an Egyptian kind of images. He used concentric circles and West African Dan masks for the faces of the figures. You'll see the slits in the eyes and in the nose and so forth. He's assembled what is authentically African American art. And in this piece, commissioned for the Schomburg, which is the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library, you have a figure here in the bottom left in the throes of white supremacy that appears like deadly vapors, a claw, and so forth. It has him down and out, near death. On the right, that figure is escaping north. This is representing the Great Migration from the south to the north, from the medieval to the modern, with a valise in hand, climbing out on a cogwheel, the symbol of industry and jobs. And you'll see in the background the smokestacks representing factories where Black people would go and work, and they would receive more money, but not as much money as their white counterparts. But they would be receiving more money than they would as sharecroppers in the South, where they're in the grips of deadly white supremacy and debt peonage, where they would be constantly in debt to the people who own the land. And here, having arrived in the towers of Manhattan, he has a symbol of culture in his hand, music, jazz, and the escapee from the north, from the south, the one who fled north for jobs, is in New York. You'll see the Statue of Liberty in the background and the saxophone in the context of the creation of culture and new. There is hope. Hope for something more. Hope for a new life. In New York, since the introduction of race as a way to differentiate and understand humankind in the Western world, Black people were caricatured in negative ways to provide legitimizing ideology for the superiority of white people and the exclusion and abuse, the use and maltreatment of Black people. The Harlem Renaissance was a movement that sought to interrogate white supremacy and demonstrate to the world truth about Black humanity. It included the migration, as you see in this painting, of thousands of African Americans and people of African descent from rural spaces like southern farm fields in the Caribbean to urban and metropolitan areas. Harlem was the destination of choice. The time period is also understood as the urbanization of Black life, from the farm field to the factory, exchanging the old pejorative perceptions of Black people for the sophisticated, educated, cultured urban ones. Additionally, this developing self-perception worked to animate a seedling of a theology of civil disobedience that began redefining African American self-worth and social expectations, according to the notion that God loves all of God's children the same. And that notion became full-grown and fruit-bearing in the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black church, as well as many others who were part of that movement. The Harlem Renaissance is generally understood to have begun around the end of the First World War and lasting into the mid-1930s, well into the global Great Depression that was ravishing Harlem during Bonhoeffer's fellowship year. Bonhoeffer's practice of theological ethics, with his notion of Christ as our vicarious representative. These elements that I'm describing here now are core to the theological worldview that Bonhoeffer assembled. All of this was a working part of his theology since he completed his first two dissertations. And it helped to equip him to enter into the Harlem world as an engaged learner. He described Christ as present in the world already, and we are engaging in an encounter with Christ in day-to-day engagements with anybody that you meet. Christ is the vicarious representation for all of humanity, which means that you encounter Christ in each encounter with another person. So he comes into Harlem listening to and engaging Jesus in those spaces as a learner, even a participant in Harlem spaces, with his through his relationship with his friend Albert Fisher as that lay leader at the church. It's with these matters in mind, Bonhoeffer as a learner and a participant in that church community, that I engage in this analysis of these two aspects of his experiences in Harlem during the school year: his time spent at Abyssinian and his encounter with the Harlem Renaissance. I'm going to give us also in this brief moment here an encounter with a poem that Bonhoeffer mentions by name called "The Black Christ," which is representative of the worship experience that he would have encountered at Abyssinian. So, when he returned to Germany, making those statements about ethnic pride as a sin against the Holy Spirit, it was clearly evident that he was different. He also had a desire for a pastorate in a poor community in Berlin prior to a major church struggle that he became embedded within between the Nazi Christians and Christians who saw opposition to Nazi Christianity as the representative of the real Christianity in Germany at that time. Majority of Christians in Germany went right along with Hitler and the Nazis, seeing them as a manifestation of God's work in the world, Hitler and the Nazis. And then there was a small segment of Christian life in Germany called the Confessing Church in the Kirchenkampf, the church struggle. A small segment of them that stood opposed to Nazified Christianity. And even a smaller segment within this Confessing Church movement were radical in opposition to the Nazis in favor of harmed people. Bonhoeffer was in that even smaller segment. His resolve that the Jewish question was a defining moment in the life of the church. His insistence on solidarity with people in suffering, and his claim that proletariat, which is working class Christians, the harmed in society, can separate Christ from the bourgeois church, from its oppressive religion. That these Christians, they hold on to Christ and are able to disentangle Jesus from the harmful entanglements that you see within the Nazified church and those Christians who are complicit in harm. They're able to disentangle them. How is he's able to appreciate that? Because of his Harlem World experiences with Black Christians who are able to disentangle Christ from the practices of oppression that white Christians engage in throughout history. Some of these influences were gained at Abyssinian Baptist. When Bonhoeffer was introduced to Abyssinian in Harlem, he was, in his own words, he says, searching to know theology that had developed under completely different circumstances than what he knew in Germany. He arrived in New York in September, and by October, he was touring Harlem. Paul Lehman, one of his dear friends in the United States, said that he spent nearly all of his free time in Harlem. Al Fisher introduced him to Abyssinian Baptist, but Bonhoeffer took on ministry responsibilities within that congregation, teaching Sunday school to a group of boys. He also taught midweek Bible study to a group of women. And if you want to know what's going on in the community, the sisters will help you understand that. He spent Wednesday evening with them. During his time in Harlem, he was an eyewitness to the initial impact of the Great Depression on African Americans. There is an adage among Black people in America that says, when white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. The economic effect of the global Great Depression in Harlem was the equivalent of double pneumonia to the rest of America's economic illness. Abyssinian Baptist was a wealthy Black church rooted within the African American tradition of Jesus as co-sufferer that moved into the heart of Harlem from another location in New York precisely to be there for the Black community that was migrating to Harlem. The senior pastor of Abyssinian, the very influential Adam Clayton Powell Sr., regularly compelled his church to engage the suffering that they saw in Harlem. and not to turn their backs. Indeed, Powell argued, to turn your back on your suffering sister or brother is to turn your back on God, who meets you as the one in need. Now, remember what I said about Bonhoeffer recognizing Christ as the stand-in for everyone. He's the stand-in for us before God, stand-in for us before each other. So when you meet someone, you're meeting Christ. This description of Jesus from Abyssinian would have resonated with Bonhoeffer's understanding of Christ as vicarious representation. It is very likely that Bonhoeffer's first visits to Abyssinian found him listening to Reverend Powell admonishing his congregation that God meets them in the suffering of their sisters and brothers. Bonhoeffer probably attended service before he took a trip at Christmas to Cuba, and he likely attended service when Powell preached a sermon titled "The Hungry God." And I scoured the archives to find this excerpt from that sermon. Powell said, "We clothe God by clothing men and women." Jesus interpreted this as a command to clothe men and women when they are naked. When you give men and women coats, shoes, and dresses, you're giving clothes to God. Now remember, keep in mind, he's preaching this sermon as an admonition during the Great Depression. If the Bible does not mean this, it doesn't mean anything. Men need sympathy, but just as men cannot live on bread alone, they can't live on sympathy alone. Jesus gave as much time to feeding the stomachs of men as he did to feeding their souls. I should tell you this story. It's during the Great Depression. Powell's church gave him a really, really nice car, and he was embarrassed by that. He didn't want the car, but he took the car as a gift from his congregation. He's driving up Lenox Avenue in New York, and he's seeing the effects of the Great Depression on Black people who have come to New York, fleeing poverty in the South, only to meet great poverty and desperation in the North during the Great Depression. As he's looking at people suffering in this way, bangs his fist on the dashboard. God, why don't you do something? As he describes it later, a couple of days later, he's sleeping. In his sleep, while he's sleeping, he has his dream. And in the dream, God says to him, "Powell, why don't you do something?" And he awoke, recognizing that as a call to do something. As any good preacher would do, he preaches a sermon series. This is a response to that dream. What you have before you, this sermon, A Hungry God. Powell and Bonhoeffer argued that the encounter with another person was an encounter with Christ, who stands in for humanity in a very concrete way, in a real way. I was hungry. You gave me something to eat. I was thirsty. You gave me drink. Naked, you clothed me. In prison, you visited me. I was a stranger, you let me in. Powell's socially concrete message of Christian discipleship was meaningful and informative for Bonhoeffer. Not only did Powell talk about helping the poor and the outcast during Bonhoeffer's Sloan Fellowship year, Powell pledged 3 months of his own salary in order to inspire further concrete involvement from Abyssinian in efforts to relieve poverty in Harlem. Reverend Powell's poverty relief efforts included a food kitchen, a clothing giveaway, and an employment agency, all run by Abyssinian Baptist. Bonhoeffer was right there in the midst of all of that. By the end of his Sloan Fellowship year, Abyssinian Baptist Church served nearly 30,000 free meals, sent out 525 baskets containing more than 2,000 free dinners, and distributed nearly 18,000 pairs of shoes. For a German theological scholar looking to be ordained, wanting to see the church not just be a relic of bourgeois culture, but to have one's, as Bonhoeffer would put it, place one's whole person under the gospel, speaking to the conditions of life for people who are hard hit by shame and poverty after World War I. He founded an Abyssinian. Christianity in Abyssinian did more than address the problem of poverty. African American Christianity is complex and diverse, but it has a common origin within the experience of a people on the receiving end of oppression and race terror. It is that crushing acquaintance with oppression and terror that gave people of African descent in America a felt familiarity with the Israelite Exodus narrative and an understanding of the way of Jesus as co-sufferer. Not only did Bonhoeffer participate in a church community that was seeking to address economic hardships among African Americans, he was exposed to a critical engagement with the race divide through interaction with the Harlem Renaissance literary movement. All right. Now I make a turn towards the literary engagement that he had. Interaction with Christianity within Harlem Renaissance community gave him a unique perspective on the dynamic involved within the racially divided American Christianity. Renaissance authors depicted white Christianity as legitimizing ideology, a legitimizing ideology embedded within oppressive structures, becoming nothing more than religious justification for white nationalism, white supremacy. In his study of the Harlem Renaissance, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was exposed to a theological critique of this blending of race and religion from within, as he put it, a rather hidden perspective. That perspective gave him insights into the theological ability of an oppressed people group to disentangle Christ from popular harmful ideology and to deflect it in their daily lives, not something to adhere to believe. So I'm going to make a move here quickly towards this poem that I want you to interact with. I want to interact with here because I feel like I'm going long here. In a letter he writes after a second visit to New York, an essay, not a letter. It's an essay written called Protestantism Without Reformation. In that essay, he's still engaging in the Black church. He comes over in 1939 for just a few weeks before deciding that he needs to be back in Germany because the war is about to start. World War II is about to start. And he's still training students in Germany, although he's lost his job at the university. He's been kicked off the faculty because of his stance against the Nazis. He's been forbidden to write. And he's under the watchful eye of the now emergent and powerful Nazi movement. He comes back to the United States because his friends want him to have a job and to stay there and to survive the war, to keep him alive, but he is decided against it. He goes back to Germany. He's writing this essay. And in this essay, in 1939, he is arguing that there's a problem within America, a divide within church, white and Black churches. He says this, that the Black Christ is brought out against a white Christ by a young Negro poet. Young Black people in the Harlem Renaissance are critiquing what they're describing as opiate religion of their elders, they said Christianity made them mild and meek in the face of violent white supremacy. County Cullen is depicting that in a poem called The Black Christ that Bonhoeffer mentions when he says the Black Christ being brought out against the white Christ. In this Protestantism Without Reformation, Bonhoeffer says this, for American Christendom, the racial issue has been a real problem from the beginning. You see, I'm going to skip ahead here. County Cullen here. For American Christendom, the racial issue has been a real problem from the beginning. The young, forward-looking generation of Negroes are turning away from the faith of their elders because they view it as its strong eschatological, life after death, pie in the sky orientation as an obstacle to the progress of their race and rights. This is one of the dangerous signs of the church's guilt in past centuries and a grave problem for the future, which is to say, your Christianity has nothing to say to the physical oppression that people are undergoing right now. You're talking about life after death only. You're not speaking to the condition that that brings about death on a daily basis in this world. The fact that today the Black Christ of a young Negro poet is pitted against the white Christ reveals a destructive rift within the Church of Jesus Christ. Many white Christians, through influential organizations, do whatever they can to improve relations and so forth. Discerning Negroes recognize serious difficulties. This is what he's saying. Blacks and whites come separately to worship. That's word and sacrament. They have no common worship. This is 1939. The strong eschatological tendencies are features of a Christianity adapted to white supremacy that make it a drug for oppressed people. And it's an important aspect of this quote from Bonhoeffer reveals his understanding of the race divide in American Christianity is that the matter could be addressed by bridging white and black worship, or perhaps somehow making Jesus come out of making one Jesus out of two racialized versions. He's hoping for that. Cullen's poem does not favor reconciliation, not trying to make one Christ out of two, but an outright rejection of white Christ as an idol. That history of Christianity legitimizes dehumanization, racial abuse, sexual abuse, murder, so forth. For Cullen, the white Christ is blasphemous. And his poem that we're going to see here is artistic representation of the climate of rejection that was present in the Renaissance. These are what's called lynching poems. It's a critical engagement with race. And Cullen's poem is that critical engagement. He dedicates the poem in this way, hopefully dedicated to white America. And it begins depicting Jesus as the first victim of a lynch mob in a succession of lynched victims that includes African Americans, how Calvary in Palestine, extending down to me and mine, was but the first leaf in a line of trees on which a man should swing, world without end in suffering. The poem consists of three main characters: a Job-like pious Christian mother and her two young adult sons who function in a role that resembles Job's accusatory friends. Both of these young men, the younger one named Jim and the older unnamed brother, wrestle with questions of theodicy, which is to say, questions of the problem of a good God who would hate evil, a powerful God who could destroy evil, yet evil existing, especially evil aimed at Black people. Since his childhood, Jim has doubted the existence of God because of white cruelty and innocent Black suffering. This is him in conversation with his brother. A man was lynched last night. Why? Jim would ask, his eyes star bright. The older one says, a white man struck him. He showed fight. Maybe God thinks such things are right. Maybe God never thinks at all of us. And Jim would clench his small, hard fingers tight into a ball. Likely there ain't no God at all. God could not be, if he deemed right, the grief that ever met our sight. Early in the poem, this accusatory language used in conversation about God is problematic for the older brother, who initially sounds friendly towards the religion of his mother. But soon we learn that he has fears for the safety of his smart, handsome younger brother. Those fears lead to bitter words of anguish over the role of Black suffering. Why is the world dangerous for this young, handsome, intelligent, confident Black gem? This gets to the theological critique in Cullen's poem or depiction of race. It's the problem of discipleship and obedience. Christ was turned into the representative of white cultural longing. And it's in that encounter that Jim, the encounter with white Christianity and his mother's faith, that something terrible happens. Jim, his younger brother, is met by a lynch mob in front of their house. And mom turns to pray. And Jim can't take it anymore. Call on him now. I mocked, and try your faith against this deed, while I, with intent equally as sane, searching a motive for this pain, will hold a little stone on high and seek of it a reason why. Which stone or God will first reply? What has he done for you, who spent a bleeding life for his content? Or is white Christ too also distraught by these dark skins his father wrought? Now, I'm going to wrap this up here now with this. The older brother accuses mom of worshiping white Christ. But recall how Bonhoeffer said that the proletariat, and he calls the Black church in the United States proletariat, is able to distinguish between disentangle Christ from the confines of the oppressive Christianity. In Cullen's poem, Christ comes back in the morning. It's not just comes back in the morning. Christ, his brother, comes back through the door in the morning after having been lynched. Christ is present as his brother. Christ, his brother. This Black family is in the family with God as a result of Christ. And those who lynched his brother were not representative of Christ. Christ identifies with this harmed family. As the older brother says that morning, "O form, immaculately born, betrayed 1,000 times each morn, as many times each night denied, surrendered, tortured, crucified." It is the family of people harmed by those oppressions where Christ is seen, not in the other forms of religion. That is the Christianity that Bonhoeffer encounters in New York. When he goes back, at the end of the year, he writes back to Germany saying, "I heard the gospel preached in the Negro churches. Here one really could still hear someone talk in a Christian sense about sin and grace and the love of God and ultimate hope, albeit in a different form to that which we are accustomed. In contrast to the often lecture-like character of the white Christ, the Black Christ is preached with captivating passion and vividness." And I want to submit to you that it is this encounter that turns Bonhoeffer into a pious Christian and advocate for suffering and marginalized people in Germany when he goes back to Germany in 1931, and then later is killed as one of those who are targeted by the government, the Nazi government, for eradication, even though with Bonhoeffer, he was an Aryan. Yet he's killed by like one of those who are outcast in that community. I've gone over, so I'm going to wrap it up there and leave time for us to have conversation.